Put a finger down if you're someone who's magnificently melanated and you feel like you were lied to about the proper camera settings to get good skin tones out of any camera. Yeah, me too. Now, when I was coming up in videography and filmmaking, one of the things I tried to expose for was obviously people that look like me's faces, because some of the rules you need to in terms of exposure aren't necessarily just shutter speed, aperture, and ISO, but there's also a couple of techniques that you need to do, especially when people are magnificently melanated. And getting bad advice between shooting everything at 70 IRE for skin tones or double breaking your light is actually a bad idea, or even pumping up your ISO to expose for darker skin tones may be something that might be sound and logic, but also sometimes ended up not being good advice. I ended up having plastically looking skins or noisy shadows whenever I was working, and sometimes depending on the camera I had greener skin tones that I'd like to see, especially on skin tones that look just like mine. Today's video is going to be an entire info dump on everything that I know about getting proper skin tones out of any camera. We're going to go through some of the internal settings, some of the camera tools you could use, we'll go through a little bit of a lighting setup, we'll also talk about the setting that you are going to be in and how what you're wearing actually may impact that, and what to do if we screw it all up and we gotta fix it in post. We'll get there. Now, shutter speed and your aperture can be adjusted in order to adjust your exposure. However, neither of those two things are going to have a drastic impact on your skin tones. But two settings that are going to is going to be your ISO and your white balance. Now, traditional wisdom would say that if you have something that's darker in your frame, pumping up the ISO would help expose for it. Now, that logic kind of makes sense because ISO, as you go higher up, you're going to get a brighter image. However, what ends up happening is that it does take away from something called your noise floor. Now, this might sound a little bit crazy, but I'm going to show you an example here. But using lower ISOs versus your base ISO actually might do you a little bit better. Now, native ISO is basically going to be the ISO value that's going to give you the most amount of dynamic range, which basically they cut a thing in the middle and then how much stops you get overexposed and how much stops you get underexposed. The only thing is, and the only caveat is that maybe sometimes you don't need all of those exposure stops, and it might be a little bit better to actually go a little bit lower, have technically less dynamic range, quote unquote, but being able to expose for some of the darker areas versus some of the brighter ones. Now, giving you an example here, I'm going to use the Pixis 12K and shoot at 3200 ISO. And as you could tell, yes, it is a brighter image. However, it is incredibly noisy in all the darker areas, but it looks clean and totally fine in some of the brighter areas. The reason why is because as you go higher past that native ISO, you actually get more dynamic range stops in the brighter areas, but it gives up some of that noise floor in order to shift things around. And then when you get to 800, it's pretty much the sweet spot, and every camera is going to be a little bit different in terms of what the native ISO is, but as you go lower is where the magic is, because some of the shadows and some of the darker areas actually appear to look cleaner. Now, this is something you could try out, but one of the things you do give up using lower ISOs is going to be that highlight information. So it's something that you have to keep in mind. Okay, so this is the easiest way to explain what I mean. So right now I'm shooting at ISO 200. Now the native ISO on this camera is going to be 800. So right now, if you take a look at the window that's in the corner, it's completely blown out. I can even see it on my histogram. You don't have any information. I can't pull that back. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go up in terms of my ISO, and I'm just going to balance things out with the ND or my aperture. And also we're going to be able to see whether or not I can get more detail out of that window, or at least it looks less blown out. Now we're at our native ISO at 800, so pretty much this is going to be the sweet spot between the darker areas and the brighter areas. But if we want to compare this to 200 ISO, I may venture to say that the blacks might look a little bit cleaner on using the 200 ISO versus 800, but I do feel like that window in the back is going to be a little bit less blown out, and I could try to see if I could put a false color overlay to see how the difference is, despite the fact the exposure is the same, and the only difference is going to be the ISO and the ND filter to match. Now this is where you might see a more extreme example. Right now I'm shooting at 3200 ISO. The exposure between 3200 and 200 are actually exactly the same. I just use my ND filter to make sure that things are even exposure. And what I'm noticing right now, looking at my histogram, I could actually pull back some of that highlight information that might be lost in that window. But if you look closely enough between the images between this and 200, my face is actually very noisy. There's a lot of shadows that are introduced in the noise. Now, this is a basic example of using a higher ISO, which might have been told to expose for darker skin tones, but you actually lose a little bit on the lower end in order to get stuff on the higher end. It brings up the exposure, but obviously my face looks a lot more noisy. Now, white balance is also going to be an important camera setting as well. So right now I have my subject at 5600 Kelvin. And what you can do sometimes is if you screw up your white balance and you go to 8600, for example, and things look a little bit too warm, or if you go too cool and you get down to 3600 Kelvin. Typically speaking, you can try to white balance yourself out within a certain range. However, this is the difference between using RAW and using something like H.265. Because when I try to white balance all of these images from their incorrect white balances, you're not going to be able to make yourself all the way back. This is going to cause a couple of different problems. Now, this is going to be the difference between shooting in RAW and shooting in a not RAW profile, because all of these also have misplaced white balances as well. There's a bunch of different in-camera tools that you can use to actually find find the proper exposure values that you can set to your skin tones. Now, two of them are going to be zebras and false color. Now, these are a little bit more common in mirrorless cameras. You can get other ones as well, but these are the ones you're going to encounter probably the most. Now, we're going to talk about IRE first, and IRE is going to be a scale where the higher the number you go is, the brighter the pixel is going to be. And the lower that you go, well, obviously the lower that it's going to be. Now, that's going to be important for a little bit later because where each individual value for certain things is going to have a particular IRE value. And that's also going to be based on the settings you do have and how you light things in order to figure out what the exposure is going to be. Now, one of the things that I used to get told when I was talking about exposing for skin tones was to shoot things at 70 IRE for just skin in general, which actually is not a good idea for a lot of people's skin tones. For example, I have darker skin. Shocker. But if I try to expose for my skin tones at 70 IRE, but there's a highlight in the background like a window or anything else, what ends up happening is that I'm totally going to blow out that light or being able to have that dynamic range to the window in order to make sure that my skin is going to sit at 70 IRE. One thing that I did learn over using a bunch of different cameras, and I'm mostly talking about shooting in log, is that somewhere it resides anywhere between 45 and 55 IRE. Now, a way that I could set this in order to figure this out every time is I could use zebras. Now, zebras is a way to actually put on a little zebra pattern, which hence the name, for the IRE value that you're looking to expose for to make sure that what you're sitting in is actually where you're going. For example, you could put 50 IRE and you could also get a little bit of a range because it's not all going to be exactly at 50. You could put a range of plus and minus 5, and that way when you're exposing for your subject, if you see that zebra pattern on skin, well, then you know that you're probably in the right range within 5 points of IRE back and forth.
And this is going to be an example of why trying to set skin tones at 70 IRE is maybe not the smartest idea. Right now, I'm at my second base ISO, I'm shooting my zebras at 70% and trying to expose for my skin by either pumping up the ISO, bringing up the light, and also that window in the background. It's probably going to be entirely blown out. I bet if I go in the false color onto this one, which I might just do, let's see how that looks. Yeah, most of this image is going to be blown out. So trying to expose for a darker skin tone and overexpose it to 70% was always information that I got, and it just didn't look as good. Now, we're going to try putting this down to 50 and see if I could change anything. Now, this is what things are going to be at where they're about 50 IRE. Now, naturally somebody with fair skins is going to be a little bit higher on that IRE scale. But if you try to expose someone with darker skin and overexpose that, if you have other parts of your dynamic range that you want to have, if you have other parts of your image that you want to have the data from, you might end up risk blowing that out. Now, this window is still going to be blown out because the sun is directly outside of the window, but being able to see more details, for example, my sweater, and also my face doesn't look like a gigantic mess, is information that I could still use in my image without having the cost of blowing out everything else. This is kind of what I meant by when getting bad advice in terms of This is kind of what I meant by taking bad advice and trying to expose every skin tone at 70%, because sometimes you might actually lose information in other areas.
And most modern cameras have enough dynamic range that if you're a little bit over, a little bit under, say you're at like 52 or you're at like 46, you're probably going to be fine. But this is a great way of being able to set it. You could map it to a custom button, and that way if you're looking for a particular IRE value, you could turn on your zebras and get that proper exposure. Now, that is going to be one way of doing things. But what ends up happening when you want to see the entire frame at a glance? I did mention before that if I try to expose myself at 70 IRE, I might blow out the window. But how exactly do you know that's happening without having to make different zebra patterns? Now, you can do this using a tool called false color. Now, some cameras do have false color internal, but you may find this more on a monitor. And basically, it gives you a color map all over the image. So that way, different colors will represent different ranges of IRE. For example, if you want to find out if you're blown out or you're getting a little bit close, orange, yellow, and red are going to be, you're a little bit over and you probably don't want to be there. Now, that pale green, that pink, and that green might be a little bit more in the mid-range. And you will see a legend with false color that gives you a line where something called middle gray is, which is basically the 0 on the number line. This is going to be around where you might see skin tones. It might be a little bit more, and in some cameras it might be like a little bit less, but generally speaking, it'll give you a range. It won't spit out an exact IRE value, but if your skin tones are sitting a little bit in that gray area, or even sometimes green depending on the situation, you're probably going to be fine and not overexposing or underexposing skin tones.
Now, we're going to go onto action camera mode here so I can start to explain how you can use false color. Now, one of the things I'm talking about, now, if you see any red into here, that basically means that you don't have that information. That red is going to be blown out. And yellow is going to be something that's going to get very close to clipping, but effectively, you might not have that information either. Now, some false colors are going to have orange, which is going to indicate that as well. But what you want to look for is going to be this little legend at the side to let you know where the ranges of things you're going to be sitting in. For example, that green you're going to see here indicates that you're at middle gray. Now, middle gray Now, middle gray might sound a little bit confusing because it's not directly in the middle of that IRE scale. Different log profiles are going to have different middle grays, but effectively that's going to be the 0 on the number line. So that way you can tell if anything above is going to be overexposed for middle gray or anything is going to be below. So anything that's going to be in that darker gray down here, the blue or the purple, that's going to be underexposed from the midpoint, that 0 line where that's going to be that green range. And anything that's going to be overexposed is going to go into that pale gray, that pink, that kind of whitish gray, and then obviously up to yellow and red. Now, one way that you can change what this is, where exposures are going to be, is I could change my aperture. Right now, I'm shooting at T1.4, and as I get a little bit higher, you're noticing that exposure is changing quite a bit. Right until I can expose for the windows outside. That way I could see if I can get that information back. Now, I do have my little diffusion into here. However, if I turn this all the way back up, you wouldn't be able to tell what was back here, and this would just look like a white piece of nothing, really. Now, the other way you could do this is going to be NDs. Now, this camera does have built-in NDs, but you could use your ND filter in order to change your exposure. And this is why having NDs is incredibly important. And you'll notice that when I go too far down, you start to see that yellow, you start to see that purple and that blue, indicating that we are severely underexposed. Now, this is going to be some basics, but now I'm going to get in front of the camera. We could see where we could put things on our false color for skin tones.
Okay, so this is what an example of putting on false color and trying to get proper skin tones is going to look like. Now, right now, you're going to see that it's a little bit on the darker gray on this side of my face, and on this side where the key light in the window is in the room, it's going to be a bit on the paler side. Now, if I want to adjust certain things, or if I want to try to underexpose my skin a little bit more, or just get it closer to middle gray to make sure that the blacks look nice and rich, I can do a couple of different things. Now, for one, I'm shooting at like T1.4. I could actually do this. I just move this down a little bit. And you'll start to see that those skin tones on the IRE, on that false color, is going to change a little bit. Now, alternatively, if I want to get a blurry background or I want to do something else, I could put this all the way up, and then I could change my little built-in NDs over here. And if you're looking at this, you're going to see there's going to be green on this side of the face, which is just above middle gray. If not, it is in that middle gray range. And then on this side, it's a little bit darker than that. Now, this is kind of what you can do to manipulate things. However, if you are in that middle side of that legend, like I mentioned before, I put the IRE scale up a little bit earlier, and this is what you could play around with. But for the majority of the time, as long as you're not clipping anything in the background anymore, you're going to be able to bring information back because you're directly in the middle. You can push and pull things as you like. Now, if you start to see blue or purple, just know that that information's probably crushed and you're probably not going to get it back. And also, if you do try to do it in post, you might get a little bit of noise. Now, in a specific situation, and something I want to answer a bit earlier on in the video, is what ends up happening when you have multiple skin tones in one image. I shot a little spec commercial a little while ago, and one of the shots we did have had 5 different people with varying different skin tones. Now, one thing you might not know about modern cameras is that in their dynamic range, when it talks about how many stops it has below middle and how many stops it has above, most of them are going to be a little bit above, which introduces a little bit of the logic where if you try to expose for the darkest skin tone that's there, chances are you'll have enough information to pull back if someone who has lighter skin is right beside them. Now, by default, I do use false color in order to do this, so that way I can see the entire image at a glance. And what I try to do is I try to make sure that my darkest skin tone is sitting in the ranges that I want to, and then in post, if I need to, I can just bring everybody else back. It's a little bit easier than underexposing for a skin tone and trying to bring it up in post, because that's where you're going to get noise. So generally speaking, I just play to the darkest skin tone that's in there, and I've been pretty fine ever since.
Now we are going to go over a common light setup. Now I'm going to use my new office as an example. I'm still kind of getting used to this space, but this is what it looks like when there isn't any light at all. Now, typically I will shoot closer in the afternoon because the light shines out of the window, which changes the temperature of the room, and your time of day may have an impact on how your overall lighting is going to look. But we are going to try to open up a couple doors and windows just to see how things are going to look and see how they can improve. Now, there's going to be a door on camera right that's going to let in natural light because it goes into the rest of my house, and as well as there's going to be a window that's going to be on my right-hand side that's going to let a lot of light in coming from outside. Now, one thing that you might be able to use to help out yourself a little bit is going to put a diffusion sheet on top of that window, or at least in front of that window, I should say. The reason why you're going to be able to do that is because it does soften out some of the light that you're going to get from outside. And if you do have a room where the sun actually goes through that window, it'll help soften up the light, but also sometimes when a light goes behind the cloud, it'll help control that a little bit because it might be a bit harsh coming out of the window, and it's nice to soften that up. Now, we are going to go into our key light, and generally speaking, I think most most people know that that's going to be 45-degree angle from your face. It could be right or left. I usually will put it on the same size where the window is, which is on the left-hand side of the screen or on my right-hand side. This is going to give me the exposure that I am looking for, and you can change the white balance of certain lights. This one is a bicolor, and that way it can match up with the color temperature coming out of camera. Now, I used to cheat this. I used to be able to put this a little bit warmer, but now that cameras have gotten pretty good and flexible in terms of their skin tones and their colors, I don't really do that anymore, but you can experiment to figure these things out. I'm also going to bounce a light off of the ceiling, which you may see on the right hand of the screen. The reason why is because it does add a little bit of level into the room. The sun hasn't shone up into the room yet. It's only like 9 o'clock in the morning. And in order to add a little bit more exposure into the background, I may point a light at the ceiling. Now, when you point something at a white surface, it will reflect that whiteness back into the rest of the room. Conversely, if you put something in front of something that's black, it's going to absorb that light as well. So you could give this a try if your room feels a little bit dark. I'm also going to have practical lights. And if you watch any Hollywood movie, Netflix documentary, or anything like that, you will see a bunch of lamps in almost unnecessary places. It gives a little bit more depth and dimension into the room. It kind of lets the room feel a bit more lived in rather than something that just kind of fades into darkness. So this is something you might want to try. If you have a couple lamps lying around, put them in the background of your shot and see if it adds a little bit more into the room. Now, we do have a little bit of secret sauce here. And as I'm turning this filter, you're going to notice that harsh highlight from that key light has disappeared. And we're going to talk about this in the next section of the video. But I do use this filter quite often, especially when I'm doing talking heads or even when I'm working with people with darker skin. Now, I am going to show you before and after and how things look. One side, I look like a character that hasn't been unlocked in Mortal Kombat yet. And the other one, well, I actually think the exposure and how my skin tones look pretty good. But if you're wondering what that secret sauce is, if you hold on for like 5 more seconds, I'm going to tell you all about it.
Now, I promise this isn't necessarily an ad for any sort of gear, but there is one piece of gear that I have used in a lot of videos, and it does help out quite a bit. And that's going to be the Short Stash Everyday Filter. Now, this isn't the first time I've made this skin tones video. I do one every Black History Month, but there was 2 things I talked about in the first version of me doing this. And one was going to be using diffusion filters. Now, you could pretty much use any diffusion filters. Sometimes I'll use Glimmer Glass. Everybody knows a Black Pro Mist. And what that does is that it helps soften up some of the digital look that you might get from a camera with the high resolution sensors we have. And at the same time, it does bloom some of the highlights a little bit. Now, I will say use diffusion filter sparingly, but one of the other things I did talk about, which might have just kind of gone unnoticed, was using circular polarization. Now, circular polarizers are meant to actually protect the highlights that you may have on reflective surfaces. So if you're taking photos of cars, for example, or anything that's reflective, you might get a harsh highlight that's made by a key light, and you want to take that down using a circular polarizer. Now, you might be thinking, Kofi, skin's not a reflective surface. It definitely looks like one when you put a key light 5 inches from my face, turn it up to full blast, and expect me to not see the giant white light on one side of my face and then my magnificently melanated skin on the other. You can try to turn this down by turning down your light, or you could add another diffusion sheet that's in here, which are all techniques that we'll show in the lighting breakdown. But one of the other ways you could do that as well is just using circular polarization. If it's going to take out some of that glaring highlight from a reflective surface, using a circular polarizer to do the same thing on your face is definitely something you might want to try out. And if you want to see an example of that, if you've seen any video in 2025, any of my talking heads, I'm using the Short Stash Everyday Filter, which kind of gives away the answer as to why it looks the way that it does. Now, I will say the diffusion is a little bit on the heavier side depending on what you're shooting, and I will make a video on how I screw that up on a shoot. But basically what I'm trying to say is that if you do want to refer to any piece of gear that might help, it might be this guy.
Now, I'm not going to break down this entire node tree, but what I want to talk about is specifically this skin node. Now, no matter which skin tone you're going to be, every single skin tone is going to fall under the orange flesh line. Now, what I mean by that, and we're just going to go over into our waveform, because if you're looking at this will kind of tell you where exposure is and where there's a little bit more red, green, or blue in a particular image. But if you are on DaVinci Resolve, going into your vector scope, you will see the colors red, magenta, blue, cyan, green, and yellow. And then the white part that's going to be into here will show you where a lot of your information is. Now, this line over here is going to be something called a flesh line, right between red and yellow. This is where your skin tones are going to lie. And no matter what skin tone you have, it's always going to be in here. Now, if you don't see this right away, you can go over to here and you could have show skin tone indicator. That way it's going to show you exactly where things are. Now, this right here is actually pretty close to where that flesh line is. And because this entire room is a little bit more warmer as well, you're going to see a lot of this information bunched up into here. Now, what you could use in this skin node over here is going to be the color slicer. Now, the color slicer gives you the ability, kind of like changing your HSL or your hue, luminance, and saturation, and you'll have control over your red, yellow, green, cyan, blue, magenta, and then skin, which would be anything that resides into here. Now, I've made a couple of changes into this. I actually purposely messed this guy up and made the skin tones even a little bit greener onto here. On this example, you might not be able to tell, but if I reset this, this actually is probably where the skin tones are going to look proper. Now, you can adjust how these skin tones are going to be affected. For example, I could turn the saturation up if my shoot calls for it or if my shot calls for it. And I could change my luminance. I could make this darker, I could make this brighter, and you could try to find a stable balance here. Now, this is going to be specific to your own taste and how you want to see things, but being able to control that little orange part, this skin node on the color slicer, or just observing it over here is going to be a way that you could change things. Now, if I want to turn this guy off and I want to open up something called a DCTL, so I'm just going to open up one of these guys. This is going to give you the ability to push and pull a couple of different tints of a couple of different color channels. I could do the same thing as well. Now, keep a look at over here. And if I want to say put more green into here, that doesn't look very good at all, but I can go the other way, put a little bit more magenta, which also doesn't look that good. We could reset this. I could change how much red is going to be inside of that skin tone node, or inside of our reds, I should say. And that way we can create ourselves a little bit of a look. Now, personally, for me, I like to try to make this a little bit more stylized. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go and apply my grade, which I had over here. And I'm also going to take down this temperature just a little bit so it's not too warm. Go to like 3,800. And then I have a DCTL that's into here. And because this was a power window, I didn't label this power grade. I just kind of made this quick and dirty while it was gone. A power window basically is going to select a certain part of your image, and whatever effects you put on it is going to affect it. So whenever I'm working on anybody that's inside of a frame, what I'll do is I'll make a power window around their face. I'll make sure it's nice and soft over here. And then I'll try to raise the midtones in my curves a little bit. And then I can hit track, and it'll track back and forth and give us a trackable mask on our subject.
With all of that said, right, we have the proper camera tools, we have our white balance dialed in, we have our short stash everyday filter, our lighting setup is on point, and maybe you still screw things up. Well, you can fix things in post. Now we're going to go over to the computer and we're going to talk a little bit about how to fix skin tones in post and also how to figure out how to color grade them. It's pretty easy to do. It only takes a couple of things on DaVinci Resolve. And also you could use this tool pretty much on any editing platform, as long as you have something called a vector scope. Okay, that being said, that was my entire video talking about skin tones for people that are, well, magnificently melanated. Now, my palm colored counterparts, some of these rules you could also use as well. You might have to change a little bit of the settings a little bit, but generally speaking, you could apply any of these or none of these or some of these in terms of anything. Now, if you're using a camera that maybe doesn't shoot in log, you might just have to use a couple of different tweaks in order to make sure you get proper skin tones. But if you could use as many of these tips as you possibly can, I'm pretty sure you're probably going to have decent looking people with skin. Don't know how else I was going to say that. Now, I want to give a special shout out to our members, because that's where some of the behind the scenes is going to end up living. They don't necessarily perform as well on the YouTube algorithm, but I still want to make that content. So the easiest thing I found doing was just making it something for members, the super fans that really want to see that stuff. And if you don't want to spend any money and you want to get something for free, you can join the mailing list, where not only am I going to send you a pitch deck template for creators, but also you'll get a shot list template as well. They're both fully customizable. You can put whatever you need to in them, and that way you could pitch to a brand, but also you can make a shot list and have a fancy little professional looking ebook for it. That being said, I hope you guys like this video. Share it with somebody, because we still got a couple days left of February, and doesn't everybody want to look magnificently melanated? Okay, I'm out of here. I have 9 more videos to record. Peace.